Thank you so much for joining this webinar today. As you well know, FEDC has three key pillars. Number one is advocate. Number two is educate. Three is connect. And we're going to focus in on the advocate pillar today. I started in economic development, before the century turned. So I'm dating myself a little bit. And in that 25 plus year time, we have experienced as a profession an erosion, and I'm going to use that term politely, an erosion of support for economic development. And primarily that erosion has come from the legislative front. Today, we are starting a new initiative to turn that tide. And quite candidly, if we do not fundamentally change how we interact and influence our legislators on every level, we will not change the battleship. We will not turn it. Okay. So this is about change. And I hate to use harsh words or serious language like that, but this is serious business. And if we can change, we can influence things for the better. So with that happy introduction in mind, I want to introduce Jeff Hendry, who is our Vice Chair of Advocacy. Take it away, Jeff.
Okay, thank you, Casey. I'm going to be very brief because our time is, your time is valuable, our speaker's time is valuable, so I want to introduce Darrick. But this is the first in a series of learning opportunities that the FEDC is going to be bringing to our membership. A lot of times we like to sit on our side of the table and really believe that we need to educate our legislators. At the same time, we've kind of come to the conclusion with some internal discussions, we need to get all on the same page as members as well, so that we're all kind of advocating with a consistent voice. So with that in mind, this is a first of a great learning opportunities that we hope transition into our practical interactions with legislators as well as our members. And this morning, as I had the pleasure of introducing Darrick down at the FEDC conference, it's our pleasure to introduce Darrick McGhee to be our guest speaker this morning. And quite frankly, Darrick's going to be leading us through a range of things over the course of the next year. And so excited to have him here this morning. Just really briefly as a point of introduction, Darrick is a governmental consultant, works for, he's a chief operating officer for Johnson & Blanton, a very, very well-recognized, incredible firm in Tallahassee. In his background, he was formerly the Director of Legislative Affairs for the Executive Office of Governor Rick Scott. And so Darrick's got a long history of our legislature. He also served in a lot of leadership positions in the former DEO and all of our critical agencies that we interact with. So I think Darrick brings so much experience, so much insight that we're all going to grow from this professionally, as well as be better advocates for the world of economic development. It's just my pleasure and honor to introduce Darrick McGhee. And I say this every time when I introduce, most importantly, a great friend and a great person. And I think we're all going to learn a lot. So Darrick, with that in mind, I know our time is short, so I want to turn it over to you to get us through this.
Yes, sir. Thank you, Jeff. Good morning, everyone. Hope you all are doing absolutely well. Thank you for letting me be on. Beth, thank you for the original reach out, and it's our friendship over the years. I've always appreciated. I want to tag on to Casey's tone and tenor, how he did his introduction. I think that's deserving. And so I put together a few slides that I think are just important for our conversation this morning and kind of what we're going to venture toward. I've had the great privilege and the honor of being in economic development from both in public sector and private sector. And so I want to kind of share some of that perspective and try to give some wisdom, but also just want to reassure us that there is never anything wrong with a key word, which is reset. And I think this is a part of the resetting where we are assessing how things were done, also assessing where we are today politically in the state of Florida, and then how do we venture forward. And so in that regard, we're going to deal with some of these slides. Beth, if you don't mind going to the next one. And so I put together the slides really under three headings. They're under the headings of the history, the challenge, and then the pre-session strategy. And I'll kind of speak to that last one, the pre-session set strategy, what that looks like going forward. But the history to me is very, very important. I don't want to operate under the assumption that we all have a good grasp on the history. I mean, we all definitely know what's currently occurring, but to me, the history is very important. So these next two slides kind of give a historical perspective. This next slide just educates us on how Florida operates, right? We all know that we have an executive branch, legislative branch, and a judicial branch. The executive branch is, headed by our governor, Governor Ron DeSantis, but a part of that also is the lieutenant governor whom he appoints, which is currently Lieutenant Governor Jay Collins, who's a recent appointee by the governor, but also the Florida cabinet, which is the attorney general, the chief financial officer, and the commissioner of agriculture. They make up the executive branch, but also in that is your state agencies. Department of Commerce is one of those that makes up that. Interestingly, in Florida, with our state agencies, you have both cabinet and non-cabinet state agencies. Department of Commerce will be deemed to be a non-cabinet agency. And what that really means is Department of Commerce has direct access and governance are handled by the governor in that regard. The cabinet agencies would be something like FDLE, where their commissioner is appointed by the majority of the Florida cabinet, being the governor and the three cabinet officers. And so the governor is involved in all of the agencies, but there are some where the head person has to be appointed by the governor and the cabinet. And so when we venture forward, we'll just kind of keep that in mind. But dealing with the Department of Commerce, I had the privilege of being a part of the inaugural team when DEO was first put together, when they merged the three entities together of Department of Community Affairs, Agency for Workforce Innovation, and Office of Tourism, Trade, Economic Development. I was a part of that inaugural team back in 2011 that entered in under the inaugural director of Doug Darling. I got a call from Governor Rick Scott's team asking me if I would consider being a part of that. I was at the Department of Education, took on the great challenge. I was excited about it because it was a challenge of helping implement what had just passed in the 2011 session. And we entered in with a lot of attention upon us, a lot of excitement, because the governor had made it very, very clear what he thought about economic development and what the future will look like. And so from a historical perspective, anything that is being done for economic development, the executive branch is critically important in that work, in that venture, in that future. And so I wanted to make sure we understood that. The second slide under history that I think is important for us to deal with, it factors in the legislative branch. And oftentimes people are intimidated by this branch because they are powerful, they are important. If you don't understand how it works, it can be intimidating, right? So all laws are created, amended by the legislative branch. As much as the governor has ideals and has priorities, the laws are created and amended by the legislative branch. And so the governor has to work with the legislature for the most part to get things done. The governor can, of course, veto legislation, but he does not have the authority constitutionally to create legislation. And so that's important to understand. So when we think about where we are today with economic development, and some will ask, why haven't we seen a lot of movement? It's not an indictment on the executive branch as much as the legislative branch has shifted. I'm going to deal with a slide in the coming future here. It's going to kind of just give you a perspective on the challenge that we face to date. But that's important to understand. So when we think about laws, when we think about several sessions ago about the doing away of Enterprise Florida, that began with Speaker Paul Renner wanting to do that. But some of us have been around. We recall back when Speaker Richard Corcoran was at the helm, they actually ran a bill under Governor Scott's administration that Paul Renner actually sponsored the bill, right? So there's always an attempt in this regard. And so then you think about the 160 legislators. There are 120 in the House. There are 40 in the Senate, making up the 160. Florida has a bicameral legislature. So we have a Florida House and a Florida Senate. And that's important because bicamerally, they have to have similar, if not identical, bills in both chambers, simultaneously making movements, but ultimately bringing that two bill down to one bill and passing. And so as much as you want to work with your senators, but work also with your representatives. And that's important. And we have seen a changing, not only of the guard, but also of the conversation around the economic development over the years. where we don't hear members legislatively talking proactively about economic development like they used to. We still have a few members who are still very public and unapologetic on economic development, like Senator Ed Hooper. But we have a lot of young legislators who weren't around for the high day of economic development incentives and things of that nature. And so they've entered into the legislature with no previous history. They've entered in with no institutional knowledge as to what's going on. And so as a result, that's been a challenge, but it's also a charge of excitement and opportunity to be able to educate. And so I wanted to give you the history so that we understand in this venture forward, both the executive and the legislative branches are critically important to the path we take. But there is no path we will take where we can bypass the legislature. And I think that's important. The next one is dealing with the challenge. And I want to talk about this before we enter into it. The challenge, I'm going to give you a historical, to make sure we're all on the same page, and then really a reminder of how we got here, right? I think that's important. So the next slide, please, Beth, if you don't mind. When we deal with the challenge, so I wanted to give a historical here. Many of us remember 2010 when Governor Scott was won governor's office in November of 2010. When Governor Scott ran for office, no one really gave him a chance to win the Republican nomination, let alone become governor. He was running as an unknown guy who had a lot of self-wealth. But the presumptive candidates were supposed to be Bill McCollum, who was at the time the termed out attorney general, and the chief financial officer of Alex Sink. Those were the two expected nominees of their respective parties. And most of the legislators had gotten behind Bill McCollum because he was going to be the presumptive nominee for the Republicans, where Scott was a retired hospital executive with a lot of money. He began to buy TV ads, but all of his ads, all of his conversations was around one word, which was jobs, right? Everything he talked about was jobs, jobs, jobs. And he believed that getting a person a job would change the trajectory of their life and their legacy. And that became what he was known for. If you met him in a one-on-one meeting, you saw him in a large speech, it was always going to be about jobs, no matter where he was at any given point. But also, he was the first governor that really became very aggressive about economic development and Florida's footing in economic development. He made it known he was going to hire a Secretary of Commerce and have that person sitting 2 doors down from him. That was where he brought in Gray from Mississippi and made it a priority. He began to sit in front of companies and really trying to encourage them to move their headquarters to Florida and bring jobs here. He was, again, unapologetic. He became very aggressive. His priorities each of his 8 years dealt with jobs and economic development, to the point where the legislature, for the most part, fell in line, and then some began to rebel against that approach. But he was that lone governor that really resurrected Enterprise Florida. We've always had a Department of Commerce, even going back to Governor Martinez, but it kind of faded out. And then you had AWI parsed out, you had Enterprise Florida, but never did you have a governor who basically put it on his or her shoulders and said, we're going to make this the priority of our state. And he did it. And for 8 years, he did that consistently and aggressively. I began to share with people in Governor Scott's second term that we would never see another governor, in my opinion, be as aggressive as Governor Scott had been when it came to economic development, when it came to incentives, when it came to the importance of jobs. We were never going to be able to see that take place. Doesn't mean that future governors like Governor DeSantis and others wouldn't see the priority, but this was, Governor Scott had three agendas: jobs, education, lowering the cost of living. Those were his three priorities. Jobs was number one. The other two and three were not as important, but were important. But from his first campaign commercial to his last day in office, it was jobs, education, lowering the cost of living. And he never deviated. He got ridiculed because it was the same old speech over and over again. But the one thing Governor Scott would always say to people is, whether I'm at a Starbucks in Tallahassee or a Starbucks in Belle Glades, people want jobs, and we have to make sure we position them well. And while Florida has a lot to offer, making it a priority of the executor became a really big thing. And so the executive branch became the great champion for us on economic development. And what you all have been doing for years locally and regionally was able now to be undergirded and really put out front. And now we became a part of a statewide assignment and approach. The next slide is the one I really want to spend some time with, because with the challenge of what Governor Scott did on a consistent basis, we begin to face challenges. And those challenges really reared their head in 2016. Again, Governor Scott won office in 2010. He was sworn in 2011. He won re-election in 2014, sworn in second term 2015. So these dates here are important. But under then House Speaker Richard Corcoran, that's when we began to really see and feel the changing taking place in the opposite direction. He began to use phrases like corporate welfare, where he started arguing that economic development incentives was nothing more than corporate welfare. We basically was incentivizing companies and basically paying them to move to Florida to compete with homegrown companies. The example he would use was there was an announcement back then about Bilo moving their headquarters, or at least moving a big part of their business from the Carolinas to Florida. And he challenged that by saying, why we move those guys here when we have homegrown publics here? And so they begin to use the phrase of corporate welfare. And you begin to hear other Republican House members using the phrase corporate welfare. They begin to question incentives. How are they used? They begin to bring Gray to the podium on a consistent basis, having him testify in committee and explaining economic development incentives while they were needed. They begin to argue that we're Florida. People are going to move here because we offer great weather, a great tax structure, great tourism, things of that nature. So we don't need incentives. And that began to be louder and louder and louder. And so as this became the opposition's vernacular, in a sense, other states around us begin to double down and put more investment in economic development. Our neighbors to the west in Alabama became more aggressive. Louisiana became more aggressive. And so for his 2 years as speaker, Richard Corcoran really began to challenge economic development in the state of Florida. They ran a bill to really do away with incentives, really tried to go after DEO. Again, I aforementioned then Representative Paul Renner was a sponsor of that bill, and Governor Scott responded. How did he respond? He began to do press conferences in these House members' districts. And while they were in Tallahassee in session, he would be in their district in front of their constituency and their business owners, basically saying, in Tallahassee right now, they're trying to do away with economic development. That's going to impact your business. As a result, that bill that they attempted did not go through. But the attack did not cease, just the bill stalled. And then Corcoran leaves office. Jose Oliva comes in as House Speaker. And I would argue he probably was the greatest of the staunch opponents when it came to it, because he had built a very successful family cigar business in Miami, and they became multimillionaires. Never took any economic development incentives, he would say. And so he would argue that economic development incentives, economic development was not needed as we were doing it, that the free market would generate business opportunities, that we're Florida, people will come here regardless, open up businesses, that we should not be recruiting outside businesses to compete with in-state companies. That became what you started hearing more and more and more. So over his 2 years, he became even more aggressive in the attack against economic development incentives. And then Chris Sproul, 2020 to 2022, he took over, and he was not as vocal, but he had members in his chambers that took on that stance. For example, then Representative Blaise Ngolia, who's now our chief financial officer, he was very vocal in his opposition on economic development incentives. He also at the time was the chair of the Republican Party of Florida. And so that he continued, they continued on within that. It wasn't as loud as his predecessor speakers, but it carried on. And then in 2022, Paul Renner, the former sponsor of the economic development bill to do away with incentives, became speaker. And he made it very known leading up to his speakership that he wanted to completely repeal and abolish Enterprise Florida. He began to converse with the governor's team on his desired approach in that regard. Then a bill gets filed, and they had a lot of public hearings that many of you testified at. But what you noticed was the agencies were not speaking out because they were not really permitted to do, but also because you kind of just see the path this bill was going to be taking in that regard. There were several senators who were trying very aggressively to ward off the bill, but ultimately that bill ended up passing. That changed the structure of economic development, where you started seeing Sports Foundation and the remaining parts of Enterprise Florida, which is Select Florida, be moved over. But you also started seeing several incentives being repealed out of statute, some that hadn't been used in years, right? But there were others that were still in utilization. And then today's structure became the realization through that legislation. And then right now we have Danny Perez as our current speaker, who's also not a champion for economic development. It's not a priority of his speakership, so he doesn't talk a lot about it. But he was in the House during a lot of his predecessor speakers, and he also has an opinion about economic development incentives that hasn't always been positive. Again, because we haven't seen a lot of movement legislatively, he really hasn't had to really comment in that regard. While this was going on in the House, the Florida Senate was still being very vocal on record about their support for economic development, the need for economic development, both in urban and rural areas. And so you started seeing those challenges take place. Danny Perez speakership will end November of next year. And then his successor is Sam Garrison out of Clay County. He really hasn't been on a record as to where he is on economic development. So while there has been some challenges over these last 5 speakers, the charge is still aggressive in that there is still opportunity to educate and generate more support and really create new allies and partners. The benefit of having a young legislature is that many of them have no pre-existing history. The great thing about having a young is that you can actually educate them and really show them the way in that regard. And so this slide here is very important because there has been a challenge before us. And so it's important to know from whence we've come in that regard. And now I want to deal with the pre-session strategy, which is the remaining few slides before us. The next one, if you don't mind, Beth. And so I put together a proposal of really how we look at how we address the upcoming session. So session begins in January of 26 and it will end in March. Many times the mistake that groups make by way of associations, by way of principals, by way of lobbyists is they never really factor in a pre-session strategy. Everybody prepares for session itself, but Florida has 5 to 6 committee weeks that are a part of the 60-day session that are opportunity to get in front of legislators. They also have delegation meetings in their local counties. All these things are a part of the actual session that are missed opportunities if not looked at. And so part of the pre-session strategy that we're going to talk about in the next few slides is really maximizing members when they're back in the districts, visiting them in their offices, meeting with them and their aides, attending the delegation meetings, utilizing the committee weeks, getting in front of our state agency partners of commerce, of transportation, the board of governors, state university systems, really tapping into them or tapping back into them and using them to be partners and extension of what we're trying to do. Because the fact of the matter is, when universities are talking about creating workforce opportunities, we play a role in the success of that coming to pass. And so creating that partnership, transportation, and what they're doing through roads, what they're doing through in regional areas and rural areas, we play a part in that. We're the boots on the ground in the areas they're trying to have major impact in. So creating those partnerships and bringing them to the table and having recurring conversations is a part of that pre-session strategy. Next slide, please. This slide here is this speaks to, there's 3 layers to the strategy that I put together. There's pre-session, there's actual session, then there's post-session. So pre-session is now up really to January 13th when session begins. Session, of course, is those 60 days, January 13th to March 13th. And then the post-session is once session signee dies, it's the after that. It's the veto proofing of things that are important to us, right? It is the engaging legislators, right? It's getting them to the FEDC conference. It's everything that happens once they adjourn session, right? This will be a long drop off from session ending in March to them coming back in December. It's a lot of time to be able to work out a plan. And so right now we're in the pre-session phase where we can really try to maximize and build momentum that is critically important. For me, it's important to emphasize that we have heard no and we have faced opposition through 5 set 5 speakers. And so we kind of know the blueprint. We know their reasons for not supporting economic development. We can build a strategy already knowing what the opposition's thoughts are and using that to actually build a fortified plan and strategy to be able to present to them, whether we're representing it or present to them a game plan forward. Because the fact of the matter is, we want what's best for Florida like everybody else does. Economic development is critical to the state of Florida. And so how do we do that where we continue to sell our state, we continue to promote our state, we continue to make impact because our neighboring states are benefiting because Florida is in this current season sleep. The last 2 slides are me just kind of speaking to um, some steps in that regard that I think are important. So the next slide, Beth, if you don't mind. So I laid out, and I'll be real quick about these. There's some advice that I gave for consideration. So right now there is a partnership that FEDC has with Career Source, and I want to commend Adrian Johnson and my man. I know Gabe's on as well. I want to thank them for this, who they are, and the great work that they do. Both of them also have a history of being at DEO and in commerce, and so they also understand the inner workings in that regard. But implement that and execute that business roundtables, right? You have with those guys. That partnership is critically important to any success that we're going to be able to have, right? The more partners, the more conversations, the more opportunities to bring legislators and even local elected officials to the room, to conversation, to be able to hear and to witness those who have interest is critically important. There's also a partnership with the Florida Association of Counties, right? So implement and execute that plan as well, and making sure that plan is put into full fruition in that regard, right? That partnership, right? That's funded by Duke Energy, like making sure that curriculum that's put together really it's forward thinking, right? Knowing where we are, but thinking forward in that regard. There's 67 counties. All those counties matter. Counties are currently going through their Doge exercise. They may be preoccupied, but they play a role, right? Because every legislator represents one, if not many counties. They all live in these areas. So being able to tap into them when they're back home is very important. I propose scheduling a minimum of a monthly training webinar, right? And it's not just Darrick McGhee coming to speak, but it's also bringing in guests, right? Bringing in, Secretary Kelly, for example, or bringing in Secretary Perdue from DOT, bringing in somebody from the Board of Governors, right? Bringing in outside parties who align with our message, who are partners of ours, that we can have a conversation, build a advocacy strategy that's both a local and state engagement. And so doing that, this is again part of the pre-session strategy. Number 4 is schedule meetings with delegation members. This is happening locally right now, right? Making sure that you are known by your local legislators. If the first time you're meeting them is when you're in Tallahassee, we're missing a great opportunity to have local impact. And so that's meeting with local legislators when they're back home, knowing who they are. You're reaching out to them. You'll be amazed how engaged they are when you meet with them in the district versus meeting with them in Tallahassee, right? So having those conversations, befriending their local staff, getting to know who they are on a first name basis, inviting them to events that you may have. If you have ribbon cuttings, if you're having luncheons, if you're having dinners, inviting them to those events. Most of you are doing that, so you want to keep doing that, right? And never be insulted if a legislator can't come, but they send their aide. Befriend that aide. A lot of those aides become the member. A lot of those aides become your best friend, and they give you access at the most critical times, right? So scheduling those meetings, make sure they have a clear understanding as to what the need is. But a key word that the Governor Scott would always use, that many of you use, is ROI, right? What's the return on investment? Being able to speak to the value of economic development and what that looks like, but also defining what it is, and so that they understand clearly this is what economic development really means, this is what it is, and this is what it does, right? Because many of them may have heard from the lips of an opponent to what it is. Now they formed an opinion that is not accurate. The next slide gives 5, 6, and 7, which is, and I mentioned already, right, scheduling conversations with Florida Commerce Leadership and DOT and DOE and the SUSs, right, engaging them in conversations. Really realizing that workforce development, right? All of those things, career and career tech, all that's a part of economic development and how we utilize that. When an employer is looking at Florida to move their business here or to expand here, they're asking questions that is important. They want to know about our educational structure, our taxing structure. They want to know about the workforce. How trained are they? Are they able to be trained to get right into the workforce? And so we play a critical role in that success. And so making that a part of our conversation, right? Identifying other economic development organizations, right? So it's not just FEDC, and there are others who are part of FEDC, right? But everybody partnering together, one sheet of music, one partnership, where we're all saying the same exact thing, working toward the same exact direction, because we all win and our state win in that regard. And so making sure that we identify who are our supporters, whether it's an organization, whether it's individuals, right? Whether it's other elected officials, figuring out who those persons are, knowing who they are. And in sports, they always tell you that you want to know your enemy, your opponent's strengths and their weaknesses. My son played linebacker at FAMU. He always talks about how when he studied film, he's trying to find everything about the opposing team. Does a quarterback do anything that lets you know if it's going to be a pass or a run? Right? Does a running back run to one side more than the other side? Right? Like all those things, understanding the weaknesses and being able to capitalize on that. And so knowing who our friends are and bringing them to the table and to the conversation so that it's never given the impression we're working against each other. And the last thing is build the strategy, right? And this strategy needs to be all about the people and about the parties, right? Making sure that we really are building a strategy where we have many mouthpieces, but we have a singular message, and that message is shared by all parties. And so that if you meet with somebody locally, or you meet with somebody here in the state, you're saying the same thing in both audiences. And so they clearly know and understand what the strategy is. I'm not naive to the journey ahead. I'm not naive to the frustrations we've all experienced. I'm not naive to the power of the opposition. But I'm also one that believes that every challenge can be faced and every challenge can be approached. And my grandfather always said you can resolve a lot of things in face-to-face conversations. And so being able to go in and have those critical conversations, I think we're in a good time because we're going to be seeing a gubernatorial administration terming out, as well as a speaker and senate president, new leadership coming in. And so this next year to me is critical time of being able to roll up our sleeves together, have these conversations, talk about everything, even the frustrations, the everything is worthy of conversation and critiquing so that we have a fortified message in that regard. Again, I'm not naive to what that looks like, but to me, pre-session is where you build the momentum that helps you during session and afterwards as well. And so we can't afford not to engage. If we take it upon ourselves to assume that success is not possible, then we sit idly, and it's another year that goes by, right? And so I think it's critically important that we able to define economic development and then begin to tell the story, right? And a lot of times is getting boots on the ground with legislators and local city and county commissioners and others, superintendents. All these individuals play a role in the success of what we're trying to be able to do, getting them to see that whenever they're seeing dirt turning in the neighborhood, that's part of economic development and how important that is to Florida and what that looks like, right? We're not trying to be other states where they just have a blank check and just writing checks. We want to be very disciplined, of course, and be able to speak to ROIs, but we can initiate this work and this strategy forward. The last slide is just me smiling on a picture, right, and letting everybody see my face so I can tell my mother I made it on the big screen. My sleeves are rolled up. I'm in this with you all. We have a journey ahead. I'll kind of give you a teaser that part of this work is, again, having webinars where we're going to have outside inviting other people to come in and speak, right? And having some of our partners be able to talk about their budget requests going into session, talking about the governor's priorities during session. All those things will be a part of the venture ahead and having those conversations and how we can actually support what they're doing so that we're not just asking them to help us out, we're also partnering with them as well. And I'll stop there.
Darrick, outstanding
Yes, sir.
presentation, and I got 100 questions, but I'm just going to pick one to
Okay.
start. Could you talk a little bit about how the House and Senate chooses leadership
Yes.
and the amount of time that it takes? So
All right.
I've heard that focusing in on the current House Speaker or the current Senate President may not be the best bang for the buck long term. Could you
That's great.
dig into that a little bit?
I'm happy to do so. So Florida is unlike other states, right? Right now, as we sit here, we know who our next three speakers will be and three Senate presidents will be, which is uncommon. So every 2 years, the presiding officer that they're called, every 2 year, a new speaker comes in and a new Senate president. Right now, as we sit here, Representative Mike Redondo out of Miami-Dade is aligned to be Speaker 6 years from now. So next is Sam Garrison, November of 26 to November of 28. Then is Jennifer Kennedy from Polk County. Then it's Redondo. There's two red shirt freshmen right now who basically are vying to be Speaker after Redondo. So the point of that is they're already running to be speaker in the out years. And so the way it works out is, as Casey mentioned, our current speaker of Danny Perez and Senate President of Ben Albritton. Ben Albritton is the one who is the champion for the Rural Renaissance bill. Although they are great, in the second session of their 2 year term, they start seeing their power diminish and their successors' power increases. And so we want to be focusing on the incoming leaderships, right, in both chambers. And so, but they usually 6 years out, they're already vying for speakership. So literally Sam Garrison takes over in November of next year. He basically won the nomination to be speaker for November of 26, literally 5 years ago. Jennifer Kennedy secured hers 2 years ago. Redondo just secured his maybe a month ago, right? But he won't even take over for another 6 years. And so this is all barring, of course, them winning their succeeding elections. It barring them not having some revolt within their party. That's happened before, right? So Chris Sprouls became speaker because there was a revolt in the party, and people who had supported Eric Eisnagel reneged on that support, and they shifted to Chris Sprouls. Chris Dorworth was later to be speaker of his class. He lost an election leading up to his speakership, never became speaker. Some of you remember the Ray Sansom situation from Northwest Florida, where he was speaker, and then a big thing happened from the budget perspective. He basically ultimately had to resign his seat and of getting Larry Credo. But usually 6 years out, they are running to become speaker of their class. In the House, if you come in with the class today, you become speaker of that class going into your senior year. On the Senate side, it's a little bit different. You really don't do classes as much as it's the majority party. So Jim Boyd is up next, November of next year. Succeeding Jim Boyd will be Northwest Florida's own Jay Trumbull, who will be Senate president for 2 years. And after him will be Tom Leak, taking over in that regard. So we already know who the leaders will be, so we can build a strategy, even factoring those individuals in mind as well.
Other
So Darrick,
questions?
I have a
Go
question.
ahead,
This is
Jeff.
Jeff. Sometimes we don't talk about this, but I'm just curious, not that FEDC would ever be in this game,
Yeah.
but please comment about how the influence of money
Yeah.
and on these candidates. I mean, it's sometimes that's kind of where some of this hits the road. And how do you overcome that? We've talked a lot about things that we can do inherently, and I think we all should do that. But just could you talk about the influence of money just briefly?
Unfortunately, ladies and gentlemen, money is a part of the political game. It just is. I did almost 14 years in public sector. I never once had a money conversation with a legislator the entire time I was in government. I worked from Governor Bush through Governor Scott's first term. I went private August 1st of 2014, which was getting ready for Governor Scott's reelection. My second day in the private sector, I got a phone call from a legislator whom I had known for 4 years, and that call was about raising money for him. He had never once asked me for a dollar up until that point. And that's when I learned how different it was being in the private sector. Um, Calls come in all the time. Members expect you to help them raise money, expect you to contribute to their political committees in that regard. And those dollar amounts vary. Some will ask you, whatever you can give me is fine. Some will call you and say, can you give me 15, 20, 25, 30, $50,000? those numbers range. And that's the truth of the matter. When you bring legislators to your events, most of them have some level of an expectation that they're going to leave with a campaign check in their hand. I try to be very upfront with legislators when that's not going to take place. Not all of them will say no. Some of them will only come if you're going to give them a check on the back end. You used to be able to counter a check by actually going and knocking on doors for them, or waving signs. That's no longer acceptable for most members. Now they want you to raise money, and it's starting as early as their freshman year, right? These guys, and one thing about the speakership race is one of the ways you garner support to be the speaker of your class is your ability to raise money and help people in your party raise money and win their elections, right? That influence really does matter. And so it's important for FEDC to understand that we're not exempt from the expectation or the assumption. But I always say this to people. If you're not in the game of giving right now and you're able to have some success without doing that, think very carefully about getting in, because once you're in, you're in. Once you give that first check, you cannot stop giving those checks. And that's critically important to understand. I also try to tell people and tell clients that when you're giving, it's important that you are careful about how you give, right? So you don't want to be just doling out checks everywhere, in my opinion. You want to be very strategic, right? You want to give to those who support the cause of the group, but also you want to think about giving toward the leadership, because ultimately, especially in the House, it's a top-down approach of authority. And so you can give to a local legislator who will try to support you, but in the House, they're going to be told how to vote and when to vote. And so knowing who leadership is, figuring out who their loyal lieutenants are, that really does matter. But money is a major, major factor in political. No one will ever say it's quid pro quo, but the fact of the matter is members do expect you to give. And this is why, for me, building local relationships matter, because if you know them locally, they tend not to put pressure on you. But if you're only meeting them for the first time and you invite them to come to your conference, for example, with no pre-existing relationship, then they're coming to speak, but also expecting that when they leave or at some point in the future, there's going to be an exchange that takes place. And so it's a major part of business, of this process that we find ourselves in. And it's only going to grow the more because of how expensive it is to campaign.
Yeah, and Darrick, if I could build on that a little bit, it doesn't have to be the economic developer
Very, very
or the
true.
economic development organization
Thank you for that,
that
Casey.
provides the check.
Amen. That's
Every
right.
single one of us has politically minded individuals in our communities
Mhm.
that are willing to write a check.
Correct.
And if I can use an old term, every single one of us remembers his or her first kiss. Every single elected official at every single level remembers their first check. And it
Mhm.
doesn't have to be all that impactful. It could
Yeah.
be $25 and that elected official is going to remember it. So I would also agree with Darrick. Be strategic about who you give that first $25 to, right? If that person has a good chance to win, we get a chance to influence how their platform gets formed, what they say, how they interact, and how they combat against the corporate welfare argument. We got a chance to do that if we get them. And the best time to get them, to be honest, is before they get into office.
Yeah. Yeah.
So when Darrick is talking about 6 years from now, they know who the speaker is it too late to even talk to that speaker as their freshman?
I,
It's
I,
not
I,
too late. We should hit
no,
it now. Hit it
it's not,
then.
it's definitely not too late.
It's
Yeah.
not too late, but it's not too early either.
Right. Very true. Very
Anyway,
true.
sorry.
No, no, Casey, you're
Oh, no.
right. I mean, that's
David
important.
has his hand up as well.
Go ahead, David.
Darrick, thank you for the presentation. Super informative. Question, you mentioned about speaking at an event. How much, obviously the money is important, but how much sway or favor would that get to be able to speak in front of a group of 500 or whatever?
Yeah.
Is
So
that
I'll tell you. So, if you go to a delegation meeting, right, they usually time you, right? Give you 3 minutes of delegation, 3 minutes, you go to Tallahassee. If you invite a member, right, like if you wanted to invite members to the conference in May, for example, of course, we would talk about who those members are, and what their relationship is to what we stand for. But I will tell you, most members will never shy away from a chance to be able to be on a stage, whether in a panel or publicly speaking in front of a group. It's major, especially when if you bring in, you know, a freshman, sophomore, junior member and they're ascending in leadership and you invite them to come speak, they always remember that because you basically gave them a platform. One of the things that members will tell you is some of them will tell you the reason why they don't support or they don't speak out is they're ignorant to what is important to you. And so it's not that they're an opponent, they just don't know. And some of that sometimes is we haven't done a good job. Other times is because it's just never going to be brought up in that regard. There's a lot of sway. And I always say this, that when members know that their constituents or a constituent of theirs is going to be at that conference, they tend to want to be there, right? Because you're not just a constituent to them, you're a voter of theirs. So if I tell them, hey, we're going to be in Tallahassee for our Capitol Days, and there are 10 people from your district that are going to be in town, I can assure you they come off the floor, their aides find time to meet with you. You bring them to a conference and they know, hey, this conference is going to be in your district. They're going to be at the World Equestrian Center, for example, in Ocala. All of a sudden, they all want to show up. They probably can't stay the entire time,
Right.
but they show up because they want to show face. They want to be able to speak, but also want to make sure that people know in the district that they were there in that regard. It's major influence. And the other thing that's important about the conferences is that they get a chance to see how many people actually show up for something like that. So now they realize it's not just 5 or 6 people. Now there's hundreds of people in this setting in that regard. And so just know that. And it was usually what we've done in past with some clients, we invite like a rising leader, and they tend to bring 2, 3, or 4 of their closest colleagues with them just to be there with them. And so now you get a chance to build a rapport at a reception or something like that. But those things are very, very important to always factor in. Always factor in. Most members will find a way to show up. Now, sometimes they'll say, "Hey, can you comp my room for a night?" Whatever it may be, depending on where they're coming from. But they want to be there because they want to be able to speak in front of large audiences. And one thing I did mention that I think is also important, stuff like that, is how you use social media matters, right? Thanking them. But also when you take a picture with that person, you want to post that they were there. They get a lot of love for those type of things. And so you're playing that game while also using that game to help benefit us.
Gotcha. Thank you.
Yes, sir.
Great points, Darrick. Other thoughts and comments from around the horn?
Casey, can you hear me? This is Kevin Carr.
Yeah, go ahead, Kevin.
Well, one of the things that I think we wrestle with is that economic development, at least in the minds of many legislators and even many people, seem to be synonymous with incentives.
Correct.
And so, you know, here we are in this world of attraction and business expansion and retention. But whenever you talk to a legislator, they say incentives. And so, you know, I had an occasion to speak with one of the incoming speakers this year about a bill that got dislodged last year. And he said the reason it got dislodged, he says, is because of, you know, this issue of incentives. And I'm saying, I'm not even part of that world. But I think we have a branding problem.
Yes.
When it comes to economic development, it's just purely incentives, and there's so much activity and so much, you know, that we do that doesn't involve that, but it gets dismissed as an issue of incentives.
And Kevin, if I could grab that, 100% accurate in what you just said. And when I mentioned the chart of like Corcoran and Oliva, when they started using corporate welfare, part of their strategy was what we're now facing now that Kevin's pointing out. It was to basically argue about incentives. So now every opponent views economic development through the lenses of incentives only. And so Kevin's right. So there is a branding, which is what I was saying earlier about we have to be able to define what economic development is and what it is not, right? Because for so long it's been defined by the opponents of economic development, and therefore problem. And also when they look at the neighboring states, those states who are highlighting what they're doing, they're usually talking about how they invested money. For example, in Louisiana, talking about film and things of that nature. So it's looked at through the lenses of incentives. But this is much larger than that. And so that education, as Kevin mentioned, is important. That branding is important. and us defining and telling the story of what it is and what it is not is important. And I think it's important to go walk into a room or in a gathering and address the elephant in the room. Hey, there's been a pre-existing opinion about economic development, what it is. We want to, first of all, let's clear that up of what it is. And from there, you move forward. But Kevin's absolutely right. There is a branding, and all of us, unfortunately, are being impacted by that branding of what they think it is. I know our time is well spent. I think Beth has some dates.
Thank you, Darrick.
Thank
Yeah,
you.
so we're kicking it off today. And here's our timeline. So please mark your calendars. We'll be sending out notices for similar engagements the 24th and the 14th. And our time together in January will be virtual. And then we'll have an opportunity in February to gather in Tallahassee to celebrate Florida Economic Development Week and host a legislative event. We'll be at the Challenger Learning Center. Then we're looking towards a date in March where we're appropriately timed so that we have very current information on the tax package and how it's coming together, because a lot that economic development, a lot of the tools that we use are affected by this tax package. And then, of course, we'll finish up in person at the FEDC conference, May 13th through the 15th in Orlando at the JW Marriott Bonnet Creek. And just to give a larger picture to the opportunity to partner with many of our agencies and partners across the state, this gives you from January through March, multiple times to be in Tallahassee, to interact with your legislators, to be with your economic and workforce and community development colleagues who are gathering around various topics related to economic development. So whether it's our Florida 2030 blueprint and how we're performing, or our small business initiatives, our rural initiatives, a focus on manufacturing, our space sector, things that are occurring in different regions, also obviously talent initiatives, entrepreneurial opportunities. These are things that we want to be engaged with as economic developers. So plenty of opportunities. You won't be alone. We're here to support you, and you'll be surrounded by a lot of your partners. But in particular, plan for the FEDC event on Tuesday, February 17th, and more to come as Darrick and I work to build out that day. So Casey, I'll turn it back over to you.
Well, thank you, Beth, and thank you, Darrick, for helping to kick off this advocacy effort. I was maybe a little too dour and sour in the beginning, but I do want to make sure that everyone understands. I'm going to use an old saying: we reap what we sow. We need to sow relationships with our elected officials, or we will get what we have historically gotten, which is not a heck of a lot. So I want to thank again. This is not an easy path, but it is a path worth taking. And you're going to see a heck of a lot more in the days to come on this, and including an entire advocacy playbook. And we've unleashed a little piece of it here today. So Beth, I want to thank you again for your leadership and keeping the trains running on time. Could not do this without you and everyone who participated on the phone today virtually. Thank you, and let's get after it together.
Thank you, Casey. Have a wonderful weekend, everybody.
Take care.